This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking with Dr. Thomas Hibbs, the Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Culture and Dean of the Honors College at Baylor University. He's also the author of the book Shows About Nothing, first published in 1999, which has been re-released this past month with new sections discussing Mad Men, the Harry Potter films, the Christopher Nolan-directed Batman movies, and some of the other Hollywood works that have debuted since the first edition of the book. And Thomas, thanks for stopping by today.
It's a delight to be with you.
Tom, let's start right at the beginning so that we're both on the same page and the listeners have some background into the central thesis of your work. Who was Friedrich Nietzsche, and how did he define, or perhaps how do you define in your book, the concept of nihilism?
He was a late 19th century German philosopher, perhaps best known for proclaiming the death of God. And he sometimes shows up in contemporary films with characters quoting him, but his influence is certainly broader than that. And what I was working off of in the book is, as you say, his notion of nihilism. That comes from a Latin word nihil, which means nothing. And nihilism is a philosophy, a state of life characterized by meaninglessness, where life lacks any ultimate purpose or fundamental meaning, where there are no longer any categories, any grounds for distinguishing between good and evil, true and false, better and worse, noble and base. So it's a society that has, in a sense, lost all of its moral moorings, where transcendent bases for morality and even for truth have disappeared. And part of what I was trying to do in the original book and now in the newer version was to lay out examples that I saw in the culture of this kind of nihilism being played out in film and television.
In 1948, Alfred Hitchcock, who had advised and edited a film on the Holocaust at the end of World War II for the British government, directed Rope, his first color movie. Mm-hmm. It starred Jimmy Stewart, John Dahl, and Farley Granger, and was based on the infamous Leopold and Loeb murder case. Near the conclusion of the film, Stewart's character, portraying a learned and worldly university professor, explicitly rails against the Nietzschean concept of the Uberman. Mm-hmm. 20 years later, in 1968, Stanley Kubrick co-writes and directs 2001: A Space Odyssey, which begins with the now famous central musical leitmotif of Also sprach Zarathustra by Richard Strauss, and concludes with the birth of one of Nietzsche's Ubermen. What caused such a sea change in the worldview of either liberalism or Hollywood or both to account for that radical a change in philosophy?
Yeah, and I think you can see Hitchcock's movie, of course, is a remarkably well done film, and part of what's going on there is that the professor, whom you rightly described as worldly and very learned, is also a bit naive in the sense that he has propagated in his classroom, or at least had students examine, these theses of Nietzsche, and then what he's appalled at is to see these things sort of enacted in real life. And I think you do see something there of the possibility of what comes out not too many years later in mainstream popular culture, which is a movement from that film, which ends by a public denunciation of Nietzschean ideas, to a kind of popularization and even celebration of the notion of self-creation. You know, it's a complicated story, and it doesn't really become unleashed until the late 60s and 70s, and then I argue in the book it's actually in the 80s and 90s that this stuff really enters into the mainstream of film and television. But you know, part of what's going on is a sort of unabashed celebration of a kind of unrestrained liberalism, the notion of freedom as an end in itself, the notion of freedom as embodied in a kind of rebellion against standards rather than looking to standards as a way of determining what's an appropriately free act from what's a bad one. So I think you do see an unleashing of a certain radical conception of liberalism where self-creation, where choice for its own sake becomes celebrated. I think also what happens in the culture after the 60s, in the 60s and after, is you get a kind of cynicism about public institutions that bleeds into a sort of cynicism about America and about the founding and about the grounding of the notion of liberty in rights, which are grounded in human dignity, which are grounded in a conception of human nature and ultimately in a conception of the divine. And once you lose that foundation, freedom becomes inextricably connected with nihilism, with kind of arbitrary acts, whether they're innocuous acts or deeply violent acts. So I think there's some of that. And then, of course, in Hollywood in the late 60s, you get the gradual elimination of any kind of production code. So filmmakers feel much freer to depict certain kinds of things explicitly that they wouldn't have earlier. So it's a complicated thing. But philosophically, what I try to focus on in the book is certain radical notions of freedom that I think are right there beneath the surface in our popular culture, and Hollywood taps into those and explores them in 2001 all the way up to, you might say, Silence of the Lambs in the early 90s, an Oscar-winning film that celebrates a sort of Ubermensch in Hannibal Lecter, who's the smartest, most aesthetically refined character. He also happens to kill people and eat them.
Right. In your book, you note that in classic horror films such as Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and The Omen, God is a rather important character. But you note that by the time we get to films such as Martin Scorsese's remake of Cape Fear and, as you just mentioned, Silence of the Lambs, the evil characters operate in a godless universe and think of themselves, to borrow from one of Nietzsche's aphorisms, as being beyond good and evil. What caused that change in what used to be a sort of potboiler escapist genre?
Right, and where it was more elevated, you're right. I mean, it's the mystery of evil that's being investigated, and I think one of the conclusions I came to in investigating this initially is that the seriousness about the mystery of evil can't be sustained unless it's in conversation with the mystery of goodness. And the mystery of God and the mystery of sacrificial love, and once that's lost from the scene, and there are a variety of cultural reasons why that disappears from the scene, especially in Hollywood, nothing much is left but the possibility of the celebration of evil, so that you also get a shift in the viewer's perspective, right? The older films, you mentioned the original Cape Fear versus the remake, our sympathies are with the innocent family that's being preyed upon. In the newer film, the family itself is depicted at the outset as lying, deceitful, unfaithful, unattractive. And so our sympathies shift from the innocent victims in the older model of depicting evil and horror. Our sympathies shift gradually over to the most entertaining and complex figure. Not necessarily a good figure, but an entertaining and complex figure who sees through the arbitrariness of morality, and that's the main character in the remake of Cape Fear. That's certainly Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And so there's a whole shift in not just in the what one might call the metaphysics of good and evil, but there's a big shift in the way in which the film is supposed to move the emotions and passions of the viewer. And then, it's not long after that really the horror genre itself becomes mixed with comedy, so that it moves back and forth between fear and comedy. We always had comic interruptions or comic levity in the course of difficult and dark and horrifying films, but here in the 90s, I think especially, the horror genre, it's the acts of evil that themselves that become comic and entertaining, and the competition amongst filmmakers is no longer to give us either simply B level films that are momentarily scary, or the sort of high-level investigation that you might find in something like Silence of the Lambs or even in The Omen. It's instead the job of the filmmakers to one-up previous filmmakers in the explicit depiction of gruesome acts. And so the audience itself becomes jaded and is no longer really horrified, but instead entertained. And that's quite a different world that we enter into at that point.
Well, you mentioned the comedy aspects of those otherwise dark horror films a moment ago. When you included the classic TV sitcom Seinfeld in the original version of your book back in 1999, including referencing the show right in the title, did you receive any negative feedback along the lines of nihilism? That's so dark and depressing. But Seinfeld is so much fun. How on earth could a show like that be nihilistic?
Yeah, a little bit. I did get a little bit of that. I did get some people saying that Seinfeld is not really nihilistic. I mean, there was that final episode where they're all put in jail and they're brought up on trial for their antisocial behavior. And some people did say, as you suggest, that it's a funny story, and I agree. I mean that it's a funny sitcom. The writing has perhaps maybe only in a show like Frasier has there been better writing for a sitcom, and the physical comedy in the characters is certainly at a very high level. But if you look at that world, the underlying assumptions of that world are sort of empty and without the possibility. They had two rules for the writers of that show: no hugs, no learning. And those, of course, are repudiations of the old staples of the sitcom, where in the end everybody had to come together. Lucy hugs Ricky and all is right with the world, especially with the American experiment. And then there were more or less overt moral lessons in the older sitcoms. Father Knows Best would be one of the most overt, but even in something like The Honeymooners, which is a great, perhaps the original, along with Lucy, the original New York sitcom, of which Seinfeld is probably the last great one. There's a lot of rough humor and so forth, but in the end, the family is together and American life makes sense. On Seinfeld, the characters are not just unlikely to end up married. It's impossible for them to end up married because they can't envision any overarching sense of how their life makes sense that would make possible a union with anyone over time. So that their lives are consumed by momentary obsessions. And as for the last episode, there is a heavy dose of moralism in it, perhaps too heavy to be believable. And then that great final scene with Jerry and George in the jail cell, where Jerry makes a trivial reference to one of George's buttons on his shirt being sort of out of order. And that of course shows a kind of trivialization of where they are in jail, but it's also an allusion to a comment that was made in the first episode, a sort of grand way of ending by showing that these characters have never progressed, have never learned anything, are trapped right where they started. All of that, to me, is a kind of indication of the nihilistic framework of the show.
Tom, there were a couple of observations about Seinfeld and nihilism that you make in Shows About Nothing that I wanted to ask you about. The first is this line, quote, "Seinfeld's insight into the odd ways rules now function in our lives is a remarkable bit of comic genius. Nothing illustrates better the Pyrrhic victory of radical individualism. We have successfully thrown off the encumbrances of authority and tradition only to find ourselves subject to new, more devious, and more intractable forms of tyranny," unquote. What did you mean by that?
Well, I have in mind two things. One is that, and I say this elsewhere in the book, that nihilism can't be fully realized or lived, because if you were to fully draw out the consequences of meaninglessness, you would just be inert. There would be no motive for even getting out of bed. So what I described in the book was a kind of asymptotic approach to nihilism, something that you can continually get closer to but never quite reach. And so what happens in that, if we can't fully reach nihilism, pure chaos and arbitrariness, what happens, in fact, is that human life becomes less complex. It becomes simpler, and it becomes organized increasingly around sort of inexplicable, because there will be a social order one way or another. And life becomes, in this increasingly nihilistic context, life becomes organized around increasingly inexplicable rules of behavior. And the other thing I had in mind is that it was, in fact, the role of rules in Seinfeld as I was watching it in syndication that led me first to make a kind of connection between nihilism and Seinfeld. Now, on the surface, the fact that there are rules might lead you to think it's not nihilistic, right? You have rules in Seinfeld for airport pickup, it's a binding social contract. You've got rules about if you have sex with someone, how many more dates you have to endure before you break up. You've got rules about what you can comment publicly concerning ugly babies. There are all these social rules that they pull out of thin air, in a sense, or out of the social context, but which operate like taboos, rules that used to make sense and continue to influence us but have lost any kind of context. So, in fact, the role of rules in Seinfeld, the peculiar way in which rules function as arbitrary absolutes that have no real grounding in anything, the peculiar way in which the rules function reinforces the nihilism rather than getting us out of it. These are not really moral rules in the old sense, rules that were attached to a deep sense of our common humanity or of divine revelation. They're instead arbitrary social constructs that yet you can't get out of. So there's these rules are unintelligible and yet seem to be just as demanding, if not more demanding, than the old rules. So that's what I had in mind with new forms of tyranny.
Another quote from Shows About Nothing, and it's a longer one, but it ends with a fascinating observation about aesthetics and morality. You wrote that, quote, instead of the body as ensouled, as the locus for the reception and expression of meaning and intimacy, the body is now a neutral and mute collection of organs and parts. The parts can be manipulated to produce pleasure. In one episode of Seinfeld, Elaine attributes her failure to persuade a homosexual to change, quote, teams to her limited access to the male, quote, equipment. When George's mother surprises him and interrupts his self-stimulation, she objects to his treating his body like, as she said, an amusement park. The fixation on the body does not unveil any deeper significance. It blinds the characters to the complementary nature of the sexes. Seinfeld matter-of-factly confirms the revolutionary prophecy of the character Renton in 1996's Trainspotting, that we're heterosexual by default, that in 1,000 years there will be no men and women. It's all about aesthetics and bleep all to do with morality, as the character says in Trainspotting, unquote. How did morality come to be superseded by aesthetics?
Well, I think that goes back to the radical form of liberalism as understood as autonomy, which means quite literally self-rule. And if we take that to its logical term, self-rule really undoes morality, because it means in the end that there is nothing binding me other than my own will. And if nothing binds me, if society doesn't bind me, if family doesn't bind me, if nature doesn't bind me, if God doesn't bind me, and that, by the way, using the term binding, that's the etymological meaning of the word religion, to be bound. If there's nothing outside of my own will that binds me, then I experience momentarily the exhilarating freedom of the artist, because I can create everything. But the second moment's reflection undoes that. If I have the second moment's reflection and I'm not simply intoxicated by the exhilaration of autonomous choice, the second moment's reflection indicates that all choices are equally valid because they're all equally meaningless. And so this emphasis upon radical autonomy leads to the notion that everything is about aesthetics and blank all to do with morality, because there's nothing other than my own will that can be the source of meaning. And that means all my choices are equally significant and equally meaningless. because the only significance they can have is what I choose at the moment to bestow upon them. And hence, in the realm of sexuality, sexual preference becomes merely a matter of aesthetics, as Renton, the character in that film you just mentioned, says. And I think we get a bit of an inkling of that in Seinfeld. They're not as radical or as heroic, you might say, in the display of their will. They're kind of ordinary people who are bound by conventions that, homosexuality, not that there's anything wrong with that, as the famous saying from the one episode goes. So that sexuality itself becomes the purpose of sexuality, and the sense that the body can teach us things, that the complementarity of the sexes, which is woven into the male and female body, these things become irrelevant, and we seek to free ourselves from the very bodily conditions of our natures in order to create whatever we want.
One of the additions to the new version of Shows About Nothing is a look at the TV series Mad Men. I had to laugh a bit during the producer's commentary on the DVD version of the episode where Don Draper and company react to the assassination of JFK. At one point in his commentary, show creator Matthew Weiner says something along the lines of, "This is where the nihilism begins to creep into the characters' lives." I immediately thought, wait a minute, hasn't this whole series been an extended treatise on nihilism?
Yeah. Yes, it is. And it's it's the sort of dramatic version. It's not a Seinfeld era or anything, but it's the dramatic version of nihilism. There are other examples, but it's one of the best. And it, of course, goes back to a character, Don Draper, who is quite literally a self-made man because he's stolen the identity of a fellow soldier who died in the field of battle, and he's stolen this identity in order to escape from his past, and hence Don can only look forward. He has to always avoid, now as the show goes on, he confronts his past in various ways, but he has to try as best he can to live, as he puts it, forward, not in the past. And this project of living without acknowledging any debt to the past is a project that is, in a sense, self-canceling, right? But it is a version, it's another version of what we've been talking about. It's another version of self-creation, which gives the illusion of freedom, but ends up at every moment slipping back into this emptiness and this nihilism. Some of the best moments in the series, I think, are when Don has an inkling of this. And some of the best moments in the series are actually when he's silent and remains silent, sort of pondering what he pines for or what he's lost. And, there's an episode early on as well where American Airlines has a plane go down, and Don's group is charged with coming up with a new advertising campaign to help them confront this publicly and then overcome it. And they keep coming up with these failed ideas for a new advertising campaign. And then he emerges victorious at one point and says, "The plane crash never happened. There is no American history. There is only the frontier." And that, in terms of his advertising campaign, mirrors his own personal life, right? This attempt to live as if the past had no claim upon us, as if it didn't exist. And the only thing that exists is the frontier, which is the place where we create the images, the stories, the life that we want other people to believe in and that we want ourselves to believe in.
Thomas Hibbs, last question. Nietzsche first declared God is dead in 1882. As we mentioned earlier in the interview, his concepts have been appearing in Hollywood movies since at least 1968. That's almost 45 years now. This seems like a box canyon that Hollywood is philosophically trapped in. Is there any road out?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to redo the book, the Shows About Nothing book, is that, first of all, a lot of stuff has come out, and there are interesting things like Mad Men, which we just talked about, that fit into the main thesis of Shows About Nothing. I think one of the other things that has happened since in this first decade of the 21st century, perhaps some of it's post 9/11 influence, that stuff's difficult to gauge, but if you look at the big box office sellers almost every year since the early part of this new century, you're going to find certain kinds of films. You're going to find Star Wars prequels, you're going to find Lord of the Rings, you're going to find Harry Potter, you're going to find Spider-Man, then you're going to find the Batman movies. Now, they're all sort of fantasy films, and fantasy films can be better and worse for us depending upon how the fantasy is supposed to work on us, how it's connected or not connected to real life. But I think on the whole, the popularity of these films is a pretty good sign in the culture. It's a sign that, because they're not just fantasy films, they're also quest films, and they're films about ordinary characters who have imposed upon them, simply by dint of trying to lead their ordinary lives, they have imposed upon them extraordinary duties and quests like the very simple hobbits in Lord of the Rings, quests that have cosmic significance for the battle between good and evil. And we see how these characters engaged in these quests succeed or fail. We see how they have to develop certain kind of virtues to make progress in the quest. They certainly have to be courageous. They also have to know what friendship is. They have to exemplify justice, truthfulness, and so forth. I think that element in a number of very popular films over the past 10 years is a healthy sign in the culture. It's a sign that there's a longing, at least amongst the movie-going public, for something more, for adult complexity in films. And adult complexity does not mean inordinate violence and lots of explicit sexuality. Adult complexity means characters who are flawed, but who struggle against evil, both in themselves and in the wider society. And even where they fail, we sympathize with them so that we understand that their plight is noble. And nihilism is not the failure of the good. Nihilism is the mockery of the good. And so insofar as we have films that present the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of goodness, the pursuit of friendship and truth and beauty, insofar as there are still glimmers of the honorable and admirable way in which characters pursue those things, even if they fail, we've eclipsed nihilism. We haven't fallen back into nihilism. And so I see some signs in the popularity of certain kinds of quest films. It also strikes me that some films about ordinary contemporary Americans, like Pursuit of Happiness, is a wonderful film about a homeless man trying to raise his son and eventually succeeding in this. So I think there are some signs in the culture of anti-nihilistic elements and healthy elements. Of course, there's a continuation of some of the stuff we were talking about earlier with horror films that have become ever more grisly, this sort of subgenre in the horror film called torture porn, where torture itself is supposed to be depicted in a way as sexually appealing. And there's certainly a good bit of that in some of our music and music videos and video games. It's a very mixed, complex culture at this point with lots of nihilistic elements, but some signs, thank goodness, and this is perhaps further confirmation that we can't ever fully reach nihilism, and insofar as we're not there, we can, the possibility of recovering from it is there if we can latch on to the kind of classical notion of human life as a quest for virtue and for the good.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in the past half hour. This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we've been talking with Dr. Thomas Hibbs, the author of the book Shows About Nothing, first published in 1999 and recently re-released by Baylor Press and available from Amazon.com. Tom, thanks once again for stopping by today.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.